Autism spectrum disorder, also known as ASD. These are some characteristics of ASD: social relationships, communication, student interest, student stress, and diversity of students with ASD. We're going to go over these in more detail here. With social relationships, this is a defining characteristic is having difficulty with social relationships. These students can be socially isolating, which is where the word autism actually comes from. Auto meaning self, and being alone. They often resist human contact, social interaction. They avoid eye contact, and they have a hard time making friends and keeping them. This is due to their difficulty socializing and reciprocating conversation or sharing interest in making compromises. Communication. So we have challenges using and responding to traditional communication, both verbally and non-verbally. Their delay in language development can cause students to be nonverbal or may produce echolactic speech, where students repeat what others say. Some are completely verbal and don't have this issue. There's a struggle to maintain conversation for those who are verbal. Students may not know how to reciprocate the conversation back and forth and get very anxious about the situation. Other students, those who are both verbal and nonverbal, sometimes will use behaviors instead of words. The student might not know how to communicate verbally or are overstimulated or overwhelmed, and they use these behaviors to express what they need rather than using words. So maybe they misunderstood what a student said in a group, and they get upset and emotional about it, and they run out of the room and are clearly distraught or overstimulated. That would be an example of behavior rather than communicating verbally. Next, we have student interests. So their interests tend to be a very narrow range of interests. They typically will pick up on something that they're very interested in, and they will focus on it, and they will really triangulate on that one thing, and they can spend hours absorbing information about this interest in private exploration and become almost an expert in that interest. For example, maybe like a time period in history or knowledge of horses or planes or locomotives, things like that. These interests may be something that we can utilize to motivate students to learn. They could also be used as a platform to help students develop socially and create better communication skills. So these interests could ultimately be really helpful if we can find ways to incorporate them into what they're learning. Next, we have student stress. ASD students typically have a very low threshold for stress. Things like changes in routines, noises and smells, and visual distractions are all things that can trigger stress for these students. All of these on the left are things that can cause them stress and anxiety. But every student is unique, and they have their own stressors and triggers. Some are going to be more sensitive to noises and smells. Others are going to be more sensitive to visual distractions. Some are going to be very set in their routines, and even minor changes, as much as like changing the route from gym class to the next classroom, can upset their regulational status. Things that they do to compensate for these stressors, sometimes they will revert back to rituals. Some can show aggression. Others can have a disruptive behavior like repetitively tapping their pencil or getting up and walking around the room, things like that. Others have restrictive and repetitive behaviors where they get kind of stuck in a loop, like swinging their arms around and doing a repetitive motion, maybe walking back and forth around their desk, or playing with a squishy toy or sensory toy of some sort. These are all things that they could do to compensate for those stressors. Next, we have diversity in ASD students. The important thing to know is that no two students are alike. Every student will have varying degrees of strengths and challenges, ranging from significant intellectual disabilities and needing lots of support to developing delays in communication skills, like using correct language, issues making eye contact, or reading and using facial expressions. The important thing to remember with these students is that the label will never inform you of their strengths and needs. As a teacher, it's your responsibility to seek information from the SPED teacher, involve the parents, become a team, observe and interact with the students to best know how to help them be successful in their educational setting. Instructional supports. We're going to talk a little bit about responses to their behaviors, ways to foster social interactions, and how to communicate with your students. These students have behavioral, social, and communication difficulties in varying degrees, and they can be compensated by using some of these instructional supports. In response to behavior, using highly structured behavior supports. Sometimes these behaviors can be hard to deal with, but most, if not all of them, can be managed with consistent and structured behavior support programs. These will help manage and modify these behaviors to make them more able to concentrate and be aware of their own behaviors. Some have more simple solutions. They are more minor behaviors in using things like social stories to teach them when it's okay to talk and not talk in class. It's great to talk, at lunch and recess, but when the teacher's talking, it's not okay to talk type stories, or using picture exchanges to communicate the behavior before it gets out of hand, because sometimes they get frustrated with not being able to communicate how they feel or what they need. Other behaviors are very minor, like extremely minor, to the point where you can almost just ignore them and they will pass over. It's more of something that they use briefly to cope with a minor stressor. Something else that can help as more a precursor to avoid any necessary responses or added responses to behavior, having a structured and predictable environment. Creating this can reduce stress and minimize behavioral issues. Use of things in your classroom like a visual schedule to help the student prepare for what's coming and what to expect will drastically cut down on their stress with what's going on in class, and knowing what to expect can help them prepare themselves to sit through and be better at absorbing the information. Having clear procedures and routines, being consistent with them, and consistent with how your lessons operate, and sticking to that routine will reduce stress by eliminating some of the unpredictable moments that cause anxiety. Much like the visual schedule, having like a set format for the lessons that you're teaching, and creating a routine that can be easily followed for every day in your class. Like, they walk in having something up on the board that says, you come in, you sit down, you get out what you need, read a book until class starts, and then you have, 20 minutes or so of lecture time, 10 minutes of group work, and 10 minutes of individual work, things like that will really cut back on their anxiety. Also, nonverbal communication options. There are going to be students that can't speak in general, and there are going to be verbal students who have a hard time communicating when they are overwhelmed or overstimulated. So having things like a picture exchange or a communication card can really help the student show you and communicate with you what they need and what they're feeling so that you can better help them come back and still be in that educational setting without having additional responses to that behavior that are more extreme. Now we have fostering social interactions. Really the key thing here is simple. Observe and teach them practical skills. Really observe the behaviors that the student has really closely so that you can understand from his or her perspective of what's causing those and why they feel that way. And teaching them practical skills that'll help them cope socially, like teaching them to wait and be patient and take turns, how to stop an activity before it's finished and not get upset, negotiate and compromise. This can come in handy being social on the playground and playing games, being able to change topics, and just being flexible in general. These strategies can help monitor their own behavior for themselves, and their practical skills will make social interactions way easier and so much less stressful. Whenever possible, you can also provide them a platform to use their interests to connect with their peers. Maybe you're doing a lesson in science and it's something that you can incorporate, and that student maybe can come up and do a little mini lesson on this plant and how photosynthesis affects it, because these plants are something that they're really interested in. They just love gardening, and that's what their interest is. Next is communicating with students. Give them time, maybe communication cards. There's this thing called video modeling that we're going to go over. But giving them time to communicate, whether it's with speech or sign language, if they're verbal, giving them time may just be all they need. As long as they don't feel pressured, they are usually more than willing to communicate with you. Things like communication boards or communication cards are great for nonverbals and verbals. Again, if they get overstimulated, it can be an assistive alternative to allow them to express what they want or need. Video modeling is also a great tool. Basically, you take videos, or you can find videos of the skill being performed, and this can help communicate to the student how to perform a skill and provide them a means to master the skill, because they can rewatch it over and over again at their own pace and use it themselves once they've mastered it to communicate and serve a purpose in their everyday life. So things that this can be used for are like initiating social interactions, ways to do that, conversational skills, how reciprocal play looks. Some academic skills can be used as well, like math, doing like an over-the-shoulder view, so it looks like as if they are looking down at their own paper, and going through the process rather than just, okay, it's a lecture and then now you just have to remember it. Things like transitioning from one location to another and what that looks like. This can also be used for life skills or functional skills like making a purchase or making your bed or setting the table. In the end, if they can't learn the way that we're teaching, we must teach the way that they learn.